the same tune. Number 361, Worship Christ the Risen King. Number 365, Hallelujah, is the same tune as Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee.
Bow together for a word of prayer before we begin. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the meaning that it imparts to our lives as we seek to follow its precepts, as we seek to follow its guidance in our lives. And Lord, I pray that you would give us understanding of it this morning, and that hearts with the truth that it contains. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Take the Bibles and turn to Job chapter 22. Job chapter 22. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect sermon. No one knows that better than me. Because every Monday morning I'm pondering, well, I could have said that probably. But sometimes they get way off track. And sometimes we need to be careful of who we allow to influence our lives. As we've read and studied the book of Job, one of the themes that you probably have noticed is that oftentimes when we hear Job's friends preaching at him, they say frequently a number of things that we would agree with. If you just sort of take them out of the context of the sermon and look at them, they say some things that are accurate. And so it's tempting to wonder at times, well, how bad are these sermons really? I mean, over and over again, we see them as examples of sort of what not to do in many ways as we teach and as we preach. And over again, I've said that many times what they say in a certain context may be correct, but in the context in which they are sort of, beating Job over the head with it, is wrong. So what is it that makes it wrong? Well, we say that it's wrong application. They may be saying something that in a certain context is correct, but something that does not immediately apply to Job. Either he's already, made correction in his life in that area, or it's something that's just simply not true of him. If you would allow me to sort of give you an example of it, that as I thought through it, kind of clarified it for me. If you were to come to me and say, Pastor, my brother is unsaved. I have been witnessing to him for years and years, but he always just brushes me off. What can I do? You're looking for some pastoral counsel on new or different ways that you could share the gospel with a relative in your life. If I was like Job's 3 friends, my response to you would be, well, the first thing that you need to do is get saved yourself. If you were genuinely saved, then your brother would have responded to the gospel by now. I hope you see the problem with that. That's pretty much exactly the counsel that Job's 3 friends have consistently given to him. Job, if you were righteous, then you would not be suffering. In chapter 22, we see Eliphaz's 3rd crack at Job's character, his 3rd sermon. He begins in the first 11 verses by trying to convince Job of the certainty of his sin. The certainty of his sin. Verse 1 says, Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, Can a man be profitable unto God, as he that is wise may be profitable unto himself? Is it any pleasure to the Almighty that thou art righteous? Or is it gain to him that thou makest thy ways perfect? Will he reprove thee for fear of thee? Will he enter with thee into judgment? Is not thy wickedness great, and thine iniquities infinite? For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped the naked of their clothing. Thou hast not given water to the weary to drink, and thou hast withholden bread from the hungry. But as for the mighty man, he had the earth, and the honorable man dwelt in it. Thou hast sent away widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless have been broken. Therefore snares are round about thee, and sudden fear troubleth thee. or darkness that thou cannot not see, and abundance of waters cover thee. If you remember back in the beginning of the book of Job, those three individuals, as they began to preach Job, they did not list very specific sins of which Job may or may not have been guilty of. Their initial sermons were just basically, well, Job, we don't know what you did, but you obviously have sinned in some way. Otherwise, such tragedy would not have befallen you. But as Job has continued to maintain his innocence, they're trying to get a little more specific here. And the certainty of Job's sin is ultimately the thing that he is trying to convince Job of in these first 11 verses. I want to draw your attention, first of all, to the first 4 verses and a theological assumption of God that Eliphaz is making. In verse 2, he asks some questions. He says, "Can a man be profitable unto God, as he that is wise may be profitable unto himself? Is it any pleasure to the Almighty that thou art righteous? Is it gain to him that thou makest thy way perfect? Will he reprove thee for fear of thee? Will he enter into thee into judgment?" Eliphaz makes 2 theological assumptions about God in these first 4 verses. First of all, Eliphaz makes an assumption about God that God is dispassionate. That God doesn't really care all that much about what's going on in the world. If you allow me to sort of say in another way these verses, these questions that Eliphaz has asked. Can a man be of any use to God? Can a man be of any use to God? Can even a wise man be of any use to him? Does it delight God if you are righteous? Does God profit in any way because of your behavior? Does God correct you and take you to court because of your piety? Eliphaz believes that God is dispassionate. I've made the reference before that they treat God as if he's some sort of divine vending machine. You put the right amount of things in, you get what you want out, but ultimately he really doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. He doesn't really care that much about what's going on. He punishes the wicked, he blesses the righteous, and that's all that God is, according to Eliphaz. His second assumption about God is actually, in a sense, correct. That God is consistent. In verse 2, Eliphaz asks whether there is anything human beings can do to benefit God. The word for man in that verse emphasizes a strong man or a warrior, in parallel with he who is wise, the wise man that he mentions in verse 2 as well. Eliphaz is saying, even if the strongest and wisest people, those with the most to offer, can they even benefit God? As I studied these verses and looked at them in different translations and tried to look at them in even the original context of the Greek, the Hebrew, what I think Eliphaz is actually trying to say to Job is this. Job, do you think that there is anything you can do to put God into your debt? Is there anything, Job, that you think you can do that puts God into your debt? However righteous or blameless we may be, we cannot give any gift to God in any way that means he owes us. The thought is that God is dispassionate. He really does. Now we'll talk about this more in a moment. But in a certain context, Eliphaz is correct that God is consistent in his character, is he not? He doesn't waver as we do, but he is dead wrong that he is dispassionate. God does care about who you are and how you live. Ultimately, he cares for your eternal destiny. He showed that in the greatest way possible by sending his son to die so that you could live with him, be reconciled with him, and live with him in heaven eternally. He is not a dispassionate God. I would call him a God of great passion and love and tenderness and care. And so once again, we have to be careful, because while there is a nugget of truth in what Eliphaz is saying, his foundation is fundamentally flawed. In verses 5 to 9, he goes in to try to give Job this description of his depravity. This is what you must be guilty of, Job. Verse 5. Is not thy wickedness great, and thy iniquities infinite? Now just pause right there on that verse and think about the accusation that Eliphaz is making towards Job. He says two things. Your wickedness is great, and your iniquities are infinite. I mean, that's a pretty serious accusation, isn't it? Job, you are a no good, depraved wretch, and all you've ever done is sin. If you remember, Eliphaz in the first sermon was the one that actually gave Job some room to wiggle on this whole thing. Well, Job, I know you're, in the first sermon he said, Job, I know you're essentially a good person, but there must be something in your life that has caused all this. And now he's saying, your iniquities are infinite. Eliphaz has changed his tune a little bit, hasn't he? Probably because of his own temper. Things have gotten worse. He then makes some very specific accusations against Job. He says in verse 6, For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped the naked of their clothing. Thou hast not given water to the weary to drink, and thou hast withholden bread from the hungry. Verse 9, Thou hast sent widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless have been broken. Essentially, he's saying, Job, your entire life, you've been abusing the power that God has given you. He accuses him of extortion, tricking others, specifically his neighbors, into high-interest loans. That's what he means there in verse 6, For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught. He's tricked them into high-interest loans, and it's kind of a loan shark is basically what he's saying. Taking their cloak as collateral, stripping them of their outer garment. In Mosaic law, which is not directly applicable to Job, but in Mosaic law, if you were to take a cloak as collateral for a loan or a service, you had to return the cloak before dark, so that they would have the garments that they needed to wear. He accuses him of not only extortion, but essentially robbery. You're taking these things that these people need. You've taken the clothing from those who need it. He accuses them of extortion and robbery, and ultimately of just being a cruel and heartless person. As he accuses them of seeing the poor, seeing someone who's literally dying of thirst, and not giving him water to drink. Would have been easy for him to meet that person's need. And then in verse 9, he accuses them of sending widows away empty, and orphans in their time of greatest need. Those two groups in society that we should take the most care of, Eliphaz accuses Job of not even caring. The idea here is that, Job, you've seen these people in their need. You saw the person on the roadside dying of thirst, and you had water, and you did not give it to them. Again, is Eliphaz right that it would be wrong for a person to do those things? Absolutely. If you see someone in need and it's within your power to help that person, you should take that as God's call, God's will in your life to help them. When they have a need and it's immediately ready for you, you have something they need or a skill that they could use. How do I know that? James 4:17 says, Therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. The idea there being, if you're a very simplistic example, but if you're walking along the road, you see somebody who's really struggling due to thirst, and you have 2 bottles of water, what do, right? That should be the simplest answer in the world for the believer. Even if you only have 1 bottle of water, it should still be the simplest answer in the world for the believer. If God has given you something, and someone else has need, you could consider that as God's call in your life to help meet that need, whatever it may be. You say, well, I don't have much. I don't have extra money to give. Maybe you're at a point in life where you're older and you don't have a lot of physical stamina to give, to help somebody move or something like that. But you can always pick up the telephone and call and just try to be an encouragement. You can find a way. You can find a way to be that person that meets that need. Here, Eliphaz is accusing Job of something that he clearly has not done. Job was a man that we know from the first chapters of great reputation in his community. You don't become a person of great reputation by being cruel to those around you. Everything that we see of Job indicates that he was a very generous person. In verses 10 and 11, we see the result, or what Eliphaz thinks is the result of this sin, or the source of the suffering. Note that verse 10 begins with the word therefore. The word therefore is a significant word as you're studying the scriptures. It tells us that it's because, or Eliphaz is saying that Job's suffering is the direct result of those things that he's just accused him of. So because Job, because you did not help the poor, because you did not help widows and orphans, because you extorted your fellow man, therefore these things have happened to you. And he goes on to describe these things. Snares are round about thee, sudden fear troubleth thee, or darkness that thou canst see, an abundance of water covering you. Snares or traps and terror, darkness, blindness, a flood of suffering has overcome Job. And essentially, Eliphaz is saying, your sin is why that has happened. It's the same song, it's just a different tune maybe, or same tune, different words, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. It's the same sermon preached for the 3rd time by Eliphaz. They are so certain that their view of God is correct, that they would throw their friend under the bus in order to be right in this scenario. That's what they've done over and over and over again. And so not only